Allahu, 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 Allah. Allahu, 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 Allah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى أهله وصحبه موالاه. Welcome to Hadith Exploration, my dear brothers and sisters. Tonight, in our study of Hadith, I'm hoping to continue tackling what we call the problem of evil. Or in the circles of philosophy, we call this theodicy. And honestly, this is probably the most vexing question a believer has to deal with. And the question goes something like this, that if God is all powerful and all good, then why is there so much agonizing suffering in the world? On one hand, nature can be so cruel. On the other, we know man can be very ruthless. So why is this entire thing allowed to unfold in the first place? And, folks, we got to give devil its due. If you truly reflect upon the extent of human suffering, this question can really mess with your head because it has a very strong emotional pull and appeal. We're told in Quran and Sunnah, Allah tells us, إِنَّهُ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ بَصِيرٍ. Like God sees everything. Like He watches everything. And then on top of that, we're told, وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ أَحَاطَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عِلْمًا. And God has encompassed everything in knowledge. So He sees all. He knows all. Then why is this madness allowed to continue? Shouldn't God be stepping in and vetoing all this suffering and putting an end to this? And this is where an atheist steps in and says, this is proof to me that there is no God. Because if God was there, He wouldn't be so passive about suffering. They go on to say, His lack of intervention is proof of His absence. So folks, how do we respond to such a loaded question? Well, last week, I gave you my first response, first of many. And let me quickly recap for those of you who weren't here last week. We began by challenging the assumptions behind this particular complaint. And folks, the real complaint here is when people say, there's so much suffering in the world. What they're really complaining about is that the suffering that they're witnessing, it seems totally unjustified to them. It seems outrageous to them. So low-key, if you go a little deeper, most human beings are okay with what we call justified suffering. Because at the end of the day, we all know deep down, no pain, no gain. So suffering has some role to play. It's the unjustified suffering that really bothers us. So when we see little kids being tortured, or innocent people being ravaged, or suffering in the animal kingdom, that's what really drives an atheist up the wall. And they say, why is this suffering permitted? The response we gave last week, we began by making a rational case through so many examples and analogies that just because suffering seems senseless, doesn't mean it is senseless. And let me repeat that. Just because some suffering seems unjustified from your limited point of view, doesn't mean it is unjustified from the divine point of view. God may have a reason, morally justifiable reason, to permit suffering that you're not privy to. And you have to be open-minded to that. Like a child whose arms are jabbed with needles as that child is being vaccinated, from the point of view of that child, is pointless, mindless suffering. In fact, if that child could, he would smack his parents and say, why are you letting this torture take place? Why aren't you stepping in? Why aren't you stopping this suffering? So from the point of view of that child, senseless suffering. From the point of view of the parents, it's morally justified. Why is this? Because there's a knowledge gap between the child and the parent. And the knowledge gap opens up the possibility that something could seem outrageous from one angle, and it could seem justified from the other. So, we don't want to jump to conclusions too fast. Rather, every sane human being knows that what they don't know pales in comparison to what they do know. And we have blind spots in our knowledge, and we don't have all the facts figured out, and we have flaws in our reasoning. So we don't want to be in a rush to put God on trial. So that's basically the response I gave last week. Now folks, allow me to build upon this now. Whenever I give this response to a stubborn atheist, they always counter you. And I want to share some of these counters with you so that you have the knowledge of this issue a few layers deeper. So you know what an atheist would say after I presented this response? They would say, this is such a cop-out response. In fact, an atheist would say here, you're appealing to divine psychology. Like, you can't help me understand why suffering happens in the world. You haven't given me a single compelling reason why children die and tornadoes happen. And now you're conveniently chalking the explanation to this mysterious divine perspective that somehow God can make sense of it all, so I should just shut up and worship. And this is where they would kind of double down and they would say, so you want me to suck it up and not complain about the terrible suffering in the world because somehow God can connect the dots, that it makes sense in God's head and from divine perspective? Well, I don't have access to God's perspective. So I am going to put God on trial. Why should I just blindly trust God and His perspective? That's a complaint that we get. This is the counter you're going to get. So what do we say to that? In response, we say, sure, you don't have access to God's perspective, but you do have access to God's track record in the world and nature around you. And this right here is a profound point. Allow me to kind of unpack this for you. Sure, you and I don't have access to God's rationale and POV. And thank God for that, because His POV would be so intellectually paralyzing. I mean, imagine what God sees and all the information He processes. And His perspective would just intellectually paralyze us because there's a knowledge gap. Quick example, like imagine you have no background in the medical field and you have no experience in surgery whatsoever. But imagine like Google invented glasses that once you put them on, it allows you to see what a surgeon sees. That amount of information would like overwhelm you, because now all of a sudden you're seeing names of veins and joints and bones and intricate flow. Like this would be too much for you to digest because you don't have any cognitive precedence for that information. Similarly, when you lift the hood of the car, if you're not a mechanic, all you see is cables twisting and turning into each other. It's a headache. So thank God we don't have access to divine perspective, because it would just paralyze us. But we do have access to divine track record in nature, God's resume in nature, and the creative profile of God. So based on that, trust should be warranted. Let me give you a quick story to solidify this point. I remember that I was working in Eaton Corporation as a senior analyst. And when I joined that company, I quickly realized that our CEO was like universally admired. Everybody loved him. And his face was everywhere, and people would talk about just how accessible he is and how he cares about his employees. And people would fondly remember those one-on-one interactions they had with the CEO when they shook his hand, all that stuff. 2 years into my job, I find out that our CEO, now mind you, I am working in Menominee Falls, that's where our headquarters are. We find out that in Watertown, Wisconsin, we have a plant, and our company and CEO decided to close that plant, laying off effectively 3,000 people, severely affecting those families and creating a lot of economic suffering. How do you think the people at the headquarters reacted to this? From the people I talked to and the pulse I was able to get of these people, you'd be surprised to find that most of the people were like, I'm sure our CEO knows what he's doing. He knows what he's doing. I'm sure it was in the benefit of the company. Now here's the crazy part. They don't have access to the CEO's perspective. They weren't sitting in those board meetings looking at cost and benefit analysis and restructuring savings and all the models that justify closing down that plant and the fact that there are no alternatives. They don't have access to any of that data. But what are they trusting? CEO's track record and performance. So, my dear brothers and sisters, similarly, Allah's divine track record warrants trust even if you don't have access to the divine perspective. Now, allow me to tell you a little bit more about the divine track record I kind of keep boasting about, to tell you why trust is warranted. Folks, if you study nature, not even scripture, if you just study nature, right now scientists cannot help but conclude that nature is incredibly fine-tuned, precisely calibrated for life. It's absolutely astounding. Allow me to share with you some of these things, and I want you to, when you have a chance, to pick up some of these books, like A Rare Earth by Peter Ward, or A Fortunate Universe by Luke Barnes, or A Cosmic Jackpot by Paul Davis. They talk about just how much exactitude is found in nature to enable life in the first place. You and I would not be breathing had it not been for the fact that there are so many variables in nature that are precisely calibrated to enable life in the first place. Allow me to give you a few. We know right now that the Earth's electromagnetic field constantly shields us from the deadly radiations of the sun. We know, for instance, that moon is at such a perfect distance from the Earth that it stabilizes the Earth's tilt, which is enormously critical for the seasons and the tidal patterns on Earth. Jupiter is our cosmic shield, protecting us from asteroids and elements from the deeper space. We know right now that water defies so many chemical expectations to be life-sustaining. And folks, it gets crazier. We know right now that the ratio of the mass of protons and neutrons is so precisely fine-tuned that if that ratio was slightly off, chemistry would not take off. check this out. The force of gravity, if it was slightly stronger when the Big Bang took place, if the force of gravity was slightly stronger, Big Bang would have collapsed upon itself. Heavier stars would not have formed, which are necessary to form heavier elements like carbon. None of that would take place. There would be no chemistry, there would be no life, there would be no stars, there would be no universe. So many things had to go precisely right. In fact, scientists calculate that the initial entropy of the universe had to be precise to 1/10 to the power of like trillionth trillion. To that degree of precision. And we're not talking about just one variable. You have 70 such variables that are documented by the scientists. All that had to go just right. So imagine like 70 dials, they all had to be dialed just in the right setting for life to emerge. That's what this universe kind of looks like. Oh, it gets wilder, folks. Now we know, and scientists are absolutely astounded by this, that nature operates on a mathematical order. Like, we can predict right now, down to the second, when sun will rise 100 years from now. Why is nature so orderly? If nothing created everything, if there's no cosmic intelligence behind this world, how did nature just fall upon a mathematical order? Gravity is so precise, we can capture it in an algebraic equation. Why is gravity so well behaved that it behaves mathematically? It's crazy. In my opinion, it's a glaringly obvious proof of God's existence. Natural laws, folks, are so exact that we can go to moon and predict landing times to the 100th of a second. It's amazing. So in light of all of this, just by studying nature, not even scripture, you can easily make 4 conclusions about the creator of this nature. Easily the first conclusion you can make is that this being, whoever it is extremely powerful. Because you got to have a lot of power to set all of this in motion. You need incredible power to take a massive body like the sun and subjugate it to our orbit so precise that we can calculate it down to a second. So that's the first conclusion you make about this being behind nature. He's all powerful. Second conclusion you can easily make, that this being must be all knowledgeable. Very knowledgeable, because you kind of have to have a lot of knowledge to create laws of physics and then set them in motion. Third conclusion you can also make, just by studying nature, that the being responsible for the cosmos and the creation and reality must also be kind of caring. Because how else do you explain photosynthesis? How else do you explain the starry heavens and the majestic waterfalls and the incredible profile of nutrition you find in nature? And the fourth and the last conclusion, very important, you can also conclude just by studying yourself and nature that this being that created you and everything around you must be fair and just. Now, how did I conclude that? Because you have a sense of fairness and justice. So if God exists, then your sense of fairness and justice also came from God, and you cannot give what you don't have. So if you have an attribute of justice because of which you find certain things to be fair and unfair and just and unjust, well, your Creator must have that attribute as well, because how did He give it to you if He doesn't have it? So if you understood this, if God is cruel and unjust, as these atheists claim, because He allows all this suffering, then why would He give you the ability to judge fair and unfair in the first place? Think about that. So let's kind of bring it all together here. On one hand, you study nature, and you can make those 4 conclusions about God. But on the other hand, you also observe that there's suffering in the world that you can't seem to justify. But you also realize, by studying nature, that this suffering is clearly being permitted by a being that is all-powerful, all-knowledgeable, seems to care, and He must be very fair because He's the one who's giving me the ability to judge fair and unfair in the first place. So then how do we reconcile these 2 facts? There's only one logical, rational explanation left, and that is He must have a powerful, knowledge-based, just and fair reason to permit this suffering. After all, He's the one who gave you the ability to judge in the first place. What I'm trying to say, folks, is just by studying nature, you can create a profile of who this Creator is. And you make those conclusions that I laid out for you. And you have to keep that in mind, and you also have to keep in mind that this same Creator is the one that's allowing all that suffering. So this has to be reconciled. If this being is fair, and suffering is also taking place, that must mean that He must have a morally justifiable reason to permit that suffering. Because after all, He's the one who gave you the compass that you're using to be so outraged in the face of suffering. So the source of your fairness is God. Who could be more fair than Him? How can you put Him on trial based on the fairness that He gave you? So, the last reason, I guess, that I want to mention today is why I feel we should trust the divine and give God benefit of the doubt, even though you can't see what God sees, I feel like a lot of people don't realize that our perspective on suffering is kind of skewed, folks. And we know through works of many psychologists, our brains are actually wired to focus on negativity. So if you're married and you ever get counseling, they will tell you that for every one criticism you give to your wife, you should offer 4 compliments. Why? Because painful things stick in the memory and in the consciousness a lot. So to kind of balance the equation, you need 4 compliments to undo the damage of one criticism, basically. And what makes it all worse is that the news cycle, by and large, focuses on the negative as well. It's the crash and the robbery and the shooting that's going to make the nightly news cycle. So for many people, their perspective and a pulse of what's happening in the world is largely skewed towards negativity. You're not going to hear about the millions and billions of people who are being kind to their neighbors. You're not going to hear about thousands upon thousands of people who are grinding for their families, who are doing their jobs diligently so our water supply is not contaminated, so air is not polluted, so our electrical grid keeps working, and nuclear power plants do not melt. This sort of daily heroism is the rule and not the exception. And I argue, folks, that there's actually more good in this world than evil. I ask you, the number of healthy days you have experienced compared to the days that you were sick, it pales in comparison. I ask you, the number of people in humanity right now who are functional versus those who are impaired, once again, pales in comparison. The number of trips that you have taken that you reach your destination safely versus where you got into the accident, once again, no comparison. The moments where your arteries are seamlessly flowing with blood versus when they're clogged, or centuries of volcanoes that remain dormant versus when they actually finally erupt, or a huge spans of time where there's non-collision of the tectonic plates versus when they do occasionally collide. Things going right seems to be the norm, evil and suffering seems to be the exception. Most people don't know this, but we have amazing studies to back this up. Our agricultural output is greater than ever without adding more land to the agricultural working, if you will. In fact, I read a study today, which is so remarkable, that in the 1830s, scientists calculate that about 90% of the world's population was in abject poverty. That number is down to 10% in 2015. In fact, daily, we're lifting about 170,000 people out of abject poverty. You're not going to see that on the news. And Jordan Peterson made an amazingly profound point. In his book, 12 Rules of Life, he says it's a well-established fact that majority of people who are abused as children do not end up abusing their children. And we can prove this fact with some easy arithmetic. Because imagine a parent who has 3 children. If the parent was abused, and abused people, if you assume that abuse people, or hurt people, well then that parent is going to abuse those 3 children. Now imagine those 3 children each have their 3 children. That's the global average for how many children you have. If those 3 children each had their 3, in the next generation you have 9 people who are potentially abused. Those 9 are going to become 27 in the next generation, who are going to become 81. In 20 generations, folks, you have about 10 billion people who would have suffered, who would have been the victims of abuse. And that would have been more people than we actually have on planet Earth. But he says, and I quote, but instead what we observe is that abuse disappears across generations. People constrain that spread. And he says, that's a testament to the genuine dominance of good over evil in the human heart. SubhanAllah. So, maybe the last thing I want to mention here before we conclude. Folks, one last thing you want to keep in mind when it comes to tragedies. We often only see the tragedies that actually occur. We don't see the tragedies that God averts. Think about that for a second. Like, how much potential wrong could there be that's being prevented that we just have no idea? How many accidents that are being prevented where we were texting and driving and it should have happened, but we were saved? And even the tragedies that do occur, how long perhaps these tragedies are being postponed from occurring until human neglect snowballs and continues until Qadr takes a step back and allows the events to unfold. Let me give you 2 examples and inshallah we conclude tonight's session. You guys may have heard of the famous case of Alec Baldwin, who accidentally shot someone while shooting a film. He thought that the weapon was empty or there was a blank round, but there was a live bullet in there and someone actually died. Now you're looking at it at a surface level and you're like, look at that random, senseless act of suffering. Upon deeper investigation, we find out that they had people who are not professionals handling weapon on the set. And what's even crazier, we found out later that there had been 2 prior occasions where the bullet had gone off, complaints were filed, no one took action. and neglect upon neglect until until court records say that it became a case of gross negligence. And now the threshold, the boiling point of human negligence had been reached. Qadr takes a step back and those events are allowed to unfold. Similarly, those of you who remember the Beirut bombing that happened 2 years ago. Now, you look at that bombing once again at a surface level with your limited understanding and you'll be like, oh my God, look at 220 people died. Why didn't God step in? Yeah. Well, upon deeper investigation, we find out that ammonium nitrate that caused that explosion and kerosene that was being leaked and torn bags where all this stuff is being released, it was a perfect recipe for a bomb for 6 years. Government officials knew. They kept dodging responsibility. They kept, deflecting it to somebody else, bribery, corruption, until once again, human error, human negligence reached a boiling point. Qadr takes a step back and the tragedy is allowed to occur. So people recognize the moral consequences of their actions. So bottom line, folks, is that instead of pointing fingers at God, let's instead look in the mirror to see what we can learn. God's too powerful, too knowledgeable, and too fair for us to put Him on trial based on abilities He gave us in the first place. I don't think we get to interrogate Him. He gets to interrogate us. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us clarity and contentment. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Thank you for staying late. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum.